There's something almost unbelievable about Theodore Roosevelt. Like someone made him up as the ultimate overcompensation story. Sickly kid who becomes a boxer. Asthmatic child who turns into a cowboy. Privileged New York aristocrat who reinvents himself as a rough-riding frontiersman. And then becomes president and uses that office to bust trusts, build the Panama Canal, and win a Nobel Peace Prize. It's the kind of transformation that seems too dramatic to be real. But it was real. And the driving force behind all of it was that he spent his childhood convinced he was going to die. He was born in 1858 in Manhattan into serious wealth. The Roosevelts were old money, the kind of family that had been rich for generations. His father was a philanthropist and businessman, his mother from a prominent Georgia family. They had servants, multiple homes, everything you'd expect from that level of privilege. But young Theodore, called Teddy by his family, was a mess physically. He had debilitating asthma attacks that would hit without warning and leave him gasping for air, sometimes for hours. There were nights when his father would bundle him into a carriage and drive through the city at top speed, hoping the cold air would open his lungs. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. The asthma made him weak, kept him from playing with other children, turned him into a prisoner of his own body. He was small for his age, thin, prone to illness. He couldn't run without losing his breath. He couldn't play sports. He spent most of his childhood indoors, reading voraciously, collecting specimens of birds and small animals, studying natural history because it was something he could do while sitting still. And he hated it. Hated being weak, hated being limited, hated the fear he saw in his parents' eyes when an attack came on. When he was about 12, his father sat him down and told him something that changed everything. He said that Theodore had the mind but not the body, and that he needed to make his body. That without a strong body, his mind wouldn't be able to accomplish what it was capable of. It sounds almost cruel in hindsight, putting that kind of pressure on a sick child. But Roosevelt took it as a challenge. He started working out obsessively, lifting weights, doing gymnastics, training with a boxing coach. It didn't cure his asthma, nothing could do that. But it made him stronger, gave him more endurance, helped him push through the attacks instead of just surrendering to them. This became his philosophy for everything. If something was hard, if something scared him, he did it more. He was terrified of being seen as weak, so he sought out situations that would prove he wasn't. When he went to Harvard, he joined the boxing team even though he was undersized and not particularly talented. He got beaten up regularly, broke his nose, didn't care. What mattered was that he was in the ring, that he was trying, that nobody could call him a coward. After college, he did something that shocked his family. He went into politics. This was the 1880s, and politics was seen as dirty business, not something gentlemen from good families did. But Roosevelt wanted to make a difference, wanted to prove himself in a rough arena. He got elected to the New York State Assembly at 23, the youngest person ever to serve there. And he immediately started making enemies by going after corruption, calling out his own party when they did shady deals, refusing to play the game the way everyone else did. Then tragedy hit him in a way that would have destroyed most people. In 1884, his mother and his wife both died on the same day, in the same house. His mother from typhoid fever, his wife from complications after giving birth to their daughter. Roosevelt was 25 years old. He drew a large X in his diary and wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." He never spoke about his first wife again, barely mentioned her in his autobiography. He just shut that pain down and kept moving. What he did next was run away, basically. He left his infant daughter with his sister and went west to the Dakota Territory, bought a ranch, became a cowboy. This wasn't a vacation or a brief escape. He lived out there for 2 years, working cattle, hunting, sleeping under the stars, deliberately throwing himself into the hardest physical life he could find. He was still a rich kid from New York playing dress-up in some ways, but he committed to it completely. He learned to rope and ride, survived blizzards, went after horse thieves, nearly died in various stupid ways that come with frontier life. The West changed him, or maybe it just revealed who he'd been trying to become all along. He came back east tougher, more confident, with this invented persona of the outdoorsman that he'd wear for the rest of his life. He remarried to a childhood friend named Edith Caro and started building a political career in earnest. He became a civil service commissioner, then police commissioner of New York City, then assistant secretary of the Navy. And at every stop, he was a whirlwind, pushing reforms, making enemies, getting things done through sheer force of personality. When the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Roosevelt couldn't help himself. He resigned his Navy post and organized a volunteer cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders. They were a strange mix of cowboys, college athletes, Native Americans, and adventure seekers, and Roosevelt led them in a charge up San Juan Hill in Cuba that became legendary. It was militarily significant but not as decisive as the mythology suggests. What mattered was the story. Roosevelt on horseback, leading men into battle, the embodiment of courage and American vigor. He came back a war hero. That fame carried him to the governorship of New York, where he immediately started causing problems for the political machine that had helped elect him. He pushed progressive reforms, went after corporate interests, refused to be controlled. The Republican Party bosses needed to get rid of him, so they did what seemed like the perfect solution. They made him vice president. It was supposed to be a dead-end job, a way to neutralize him by giving him a position with no real power. Then President McKinley was assassinated, shot by an anarchist at a public event. And suddenly Theodore Roosevelt, at 42, was the youngest president in American history. The Republican establishment was horrified. Mark Hanna, a powerful senator, supposedly said, "Now look, that damned cowboy is president of the United States." He wasn't wrong to be worried. Roosevelt used the presidency the way he'd used everything else in his life, as a test of will, a way to prove he could do more than anyone expected. He went after the big corporations, the monopolies and trusts that controlled entire industries. He didn't destroy them, but he regulated them, established the principle that government could intervene in the economy to protect the public interest. He created national parks and forests, setting aside millions of acres for conservation because he believed wilderness was essential to the American. But he was also genuinely brave in ways that are hard to dispute. In 1912, after he'd left office and was running for president again as a third-party candidate, he was shot in the chest before a campaign speech. The bullet went through his glasses case, and the folded manuscript of his speech slowed down enough that it lodged in his chest muscle instead of reaching his heart. Roosevelt refused medical attention, went on stage, and delivered a 90-minute speech with a bullet in his chest. He started by telling the audience, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." That wasn't bravado performed for the cameras. That was who he'd made himself into. There's something almost pathological about it, though, when you step back. This constant need to prove his toughness, to test himself, to never show weakness. He hunted dangerous animals obsessively, went on expeditions to Africa and South America that nearly killed him. On one trip down an uncharted river in Brazil, he got a severe infection, nearly died from fever and blood poisoning, lost a quarter of his body weight. He came back permanently weakened, but insisted the trip had been worth it because they'd mapped an unknown river. His sons absorbed this philosophy, and it cost them. When World War I broke out, Roosevelt pushed all 4 of his boys to enlist and fight, even though America wasn't in the war yet. He saw it as their duty, their test. His youngest son, Quentin, was shot down over France in 1918 and killed. Roosevelt was devastated but refused to show it publicly, kept up the tough exterior even as friends said he was destroyed inside. He died less than a year later, at 60, probably partly from the grief and partly from a lifetime of pushing his body past its limits. Looking at his life from this distance, it's clear that everything he accomplished came from this deep, relentless need to overcome what he'd been as a child. The sickly, asthmatic boy who couldn't breathe became the man who couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop proving, couldn't stop testing himself against every possible challenge. He turned his weakness into the engine that drove everything. But you have to wonder if he ever felt like it was enough, or if he was always still that scared kid trying to convince everyone, including himself, that he was strong. His political legacy is complicated. He expanded presidential power in ways that future presidents would use for good and bad. He was progressive on labor and corporate regulation, but conservative on social issues and race. He preached conservation, but also loved killing animals. He talked about peace but glorified war. He was a mass of contradictions held together by sheer force of will and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. But what's undeniable is the transformation itself. He literally made himself into a different person through determination and relentless effort. The body that was supposed to be his prison became his weapon. The weakness that could have defined him became the thing he defined himself against. That's not just inspiring, it's almost frightening in its intensity. Most people who face limitations learn to work within them or around them. Roosevelt just refused to accept them at all. He wrote once that the credit belongs to the man in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly and errs and comes up short again and again, but who knows the great enthusiasms and the great devotions. That wasn't abstract philosophy for him, that was autobiography. He spent his entire life in various arenas, fighting various battles, always with his face marred by dust and sweat and blood, literal or metaphorical. The question is whether that's a model worth following or a warning about the cost of never being satisfied. Because Roosevelt achieved incredible things, but also damaged himself and the people around him. He changed America in lasting ways, but also promoted ideas and policies that we'd now recognize as harmful. He proved that you can overcome enormous obstacles through willpower, but also that overcoming obstacles can become an addiction that prevents you from ever being at peace. His childhood asthma didn't kill him, but it might have been the thing that made him who he was. Without that weakness, without that terror of being frail and helpless, would he have had the same drive? Would he have pushed himself into politics, into war, into the presidency? Or would he have just been another wealthy New York heir living a comfortable, unremarkable life? The asthma was the thing he spent his life running from, and that running took him further than almost anyone else has gone. There's footage of him from late in his life, old newsreels where you can see him giving speeches, shaking hands, always moving. Even on film, even silent and grainy, you can feel the energy, the intensity, the absolute refusal to be still. He's an old man by then, worn down by disease and grief and a lifetime of physical abuse, but he's still performing strength, still projecting that image of vigor and power. It's compelling and sad at the same time. After he died, his son wrote that his father's death was like having a natural force suddenly stop. Not a person dying, but something elemental ceasing to exist. That captures something true about him. He wasn't just a man, he was a phenomenon, a concentration of will and energy that bent reality around itself through sheer refusal to accept limitations. But he was also just a person, a complicated one, shaped by fear and privilege and the expectations of his time. He turned his weakness into strength, absolutely. But he never stopped fighting the ghost of that weak child, never stopped trying to prove something that maybe didn't need proving anymore. And that's the tragedy underneath the triumph. He won every battle except the one against his own insecurities. The modern world loves Roosevelt because he fits so neatly into certain narratives we tell ourselves. The self-made man, even though he started with every advantage. The warrior scholar. The conservationist who also loved hunting. The progressive who also believed in American empire. He's complicated enough to be interesting, but heroic enough to be inspiring. We can pick the parts we like and ignore the parts that make us uncomfortable. But if you take him as a whole, what you get is someone who shows both the power and the danger of refusing to accept your limitations. He accomplished extraordinary things because he wouldn't let his body or his circumstances define him. But he also hurt people, including himself, because he couldn't accept that some limitations are real and some battles don't need to be fought. He turned weakness into strength, but couldn't turn that strength into peace. That's probably the most honest lesson from his life. Not that you can overcome anything through willpower, though you can overcome a lot. Not that limitations are just excuses, though some are. But that the things we're running from shape us as much as the things we're running toward, and that transforming yourself completely doesn't necessarily mean you'll like who you become or that the transformation was worth what it cost. Roosevelt would probably hate that conclusion. He believed in action, in striving, in the glory of the struggle itself. He'd say the cost was worth it because the alternative was worse, that being weak or timid or safe was a kind of living death. And maybe he was right, at least for himself. Maybe for someone with his particular demons and his particular gifts, there was no other path. Maybe he had to be who he became because anything else would have been a betrayal of that scared, asthmatic kid who decided to make his body and ended up remaking the world along with it. But the rest of us aren't Theodore Roosevelt. We don't have his advantages or his demons.